Imagine pushing a door so low that you have to tilt your head to enter. And the moment you cross the threshold, the world outside disappears. The air changes. It gets colder, thicker, laden with the smell of damp stone and old smoke that never quite went away. You don't enter a house as you imagined. You enter a rock. The walls weren't built. They were excavated, irregular, rough to the touch, with visible marks from tools that scraped the soft limestone from the hill. Archaeologists discovered that the type of stone here, known as nari, allowed just that, digging into the earth, creating environments that were part cave, part human construction. And that changes everything, because there is no space left. The ceiling is low enough that you feel the constant proximity, almost as if the house is pressing you back against the ground. The light is minimal. Only thin openings high in the wall let in a gray wisp of dawn. Evidence suggests that these openings were designed more for ventilation and privacy than for actual lighting. And then you realize something no one told you. There is no comfortable as you know it. There is no clear division between where you sleep, where you store food, and where you live. It's all a single compressed space. But this raises an uncomfortable question. How does an entire family live in here every day? Look at the floor. There is no wood. There is no polished stone, just packed earth, perhaps mixed with fragments of compressed limestone, smoothed by years of continuous use. Archaeological evidence shows that floors like this were maintained with constant sweeping and manual compaction, creating a surprisingly firm surface. Now imagine your body on that floor. No bed, no mattress, just a reed mat, thin, flexible, practically glued to the ground. And what covers you at night is not a separate blanket. It's the same clothes you wear during the day, and this is not a cultural detail. It's necessity. The Torah, centuries before, already provided for this. A creditor could not keep a poor man's cloak overnight because that was what he used to sleep in. Scholars point out that this law reveals something profound. Many families simply had no other option. But wait, does that mean everyone slept here? Yes, in the same space, bodies lined up on the floor side by side. Parents, children, perhaps relatives. No privacy, no absolute silence, just the collective breathing of a family living within a few meters. And then you feel the air again, a slight burning sensation in the nose, remnant of what burned during the night. Look at a small clay object in the corner, an oil lamp about the size of your palm. Evidence suggests that these lamps produced more smoke than light, leaving a dark film on walls over time. Lighting here does not eliminate darkness. She just pushes it back a little. And it changes the way you understand phrases you've heard before. But we're not there yet, because the most important thing is still hidden. What you're seeing isn't just a simple house. It's an environment where every inch was fought for, where every resource was limited, and where living wasn't comfortable. It was strategic. And that raises something even deeper. If this was the physical space, what was it like to live emotionally inside it? Because the house wasn't just small. She was the center of a silent fight for survival. And what happened outside these walls made everything even more intense. But that changes completely when you cross a second opening and enter the true heart of the house. Now you step through the narrow opening and the house finally breathes. After the crushed gloom of the interior, the courtyard seems almost a relief. Not because it's big, it is not, but because, for the first time, There is sky above you, real light, moving air, a space where the body can move without touching stone all the time. And this is where life really happens, not in the excavated room, not in the dark corner where the family sleeps, but in this open center with dirt floors or rustic stone, where every gesture of the day needs to fit. Archaeologists discovered that many houses in Nazareth in the early Roman period were organized around small inner courtyards, with rock-cut areas and outbuildings constructed of fieldstone held together by clay and straw. Look carefully. Nothing here was made to spare. Everything was made to serve. Leaning against the wall, ceramic jars store grains, olive oil, and the little that can be preserved. Reed baskets hang to ward off insects and mice. A clay oven, blackened from constant use, occupies one side. Maybe a goat is tied up in a corner. Maybe chickens scratch in the dust. There is no elegant separation between home and work, between home and survival. It's all the same thing. And this is what most people never imagine. When we think of home, we think of rest, in privacy, in refuge. But here, home is a workshop for life. Home is production. Home is resistance. And this creates a much more intense human experience than it seems, because the space doesn't just house the family. Space disciplines the family. You learn to walk without wasting movement. Learn to store each object in its exact place. Learn to share the same environment with heat, smoke, animals, utensils, and people. Scholars estimate that villages like Nazarene had small houses, concentrated in a small area, which made physical proximity a permanent feature of everyday life. But there is something even stronger here. The entire house seems built around scarcity. The walls retain the nighttime coolness for a few hours, but they also retain smell. The oven heats the room, but it also makes it heavy. Ventilation exists, but is limited. Oil and fuel smoke rises slowly, clings to surfaces, enters the fabric of clothes, hair, and skin. You don't just live in this space, you carry this space in your body. This is the detail that changes everything. The simplicity of a Nazarene house was not aesthetic. It wasn't minimalism. It was not a romantic spiritual choice. It was adaptation. It was the most practical way to stay alive in a low-resource environment with local materials and urgent needs. Evidence suggests that the combination of excavated rock, stacked stone walls, and earthen mortar was an efficient, inexpensive solution and deeply tied to the terrain of Nazareth. And for that reason, each meter had a function. Each shadow had a function. Each opening had a function. But this raises an even deeper question. If space was already so tight, so saturated, so calculated, what happened when the most basic need of all started to be missing? Because a house like that could withstand heat, could withstand smoke. I could tolerate a lack of comfort, but there was one thing that turned tension into despair very quickly: water. And that's exactly where the heart of this house reveals its quietest fragility. And then you realize that the entire house revolves around an anxiety that never goes away. It's not a lack of space. It's not simple food. It's not even the smoke. It's the water. Look at the courtyard once more. Near the edge, or carved into the limestone beneath your feet, is the most important structure in the entire house: the cistern. It's not just a reservoir. It's the difference between continuing to live or starting to count the days. Archaeologists discovered in Nazareth open cisterns directly in the bedrock, often deep and flared in shape, designed to capture winter rain and store it. during long dry periods. This means that every drop has already arrived here with effort. She fell onto the flat ceiling. It flowed through simple channels. It passed through a decantation area so that earth and impurities could settle. Only then did it descend to the main reservoir, whose walls received an impermeable coating of lime, ash, and crushed ceramic to prevent leaks in the porous stone. Evidence suggests that this type of domestic engineering was not a luxury, but an absolute necessity in Galilee villages with limited access to permanent sources. Now imagine the sound. Not the water running free, but the sound of water being measured, taken slowly, controlled, watched. A jug dives, the rope tensions, the container rises heavily, and in that simple movement is hidden daily mathematics. How much to drink, how much to cook, how much to clean, how much to save for tomorrow. Because tomorrow it might not rain, and neither will the day after tomorrow. But that's not all. The water from the cistern is not just for quenching thirst. She goes through everything. Bread dough, lentil stew, basic hand washing, minimum cleaning of utensils, perhaps some ritual care, because it suggests evidence that the concern with purity was real in Nazareth, as shown by the limestone containers found in the region, chosen precisely because of their relationship with the Jewish laws of purity. Suddenly, you understand the psychological weight of this. Opening a jar was not a neutral gesture. It was a decision. It was responsibility. It was limit. In a world with taps, you use water without thinking. Here, each use has a conscience. Every waste would almost be a sin against the survival of the house. And this shapes the body, the mood, the rhythm of the family. You learn early not to spill, not to exaggerate, not asking for more than necessary, and here comes the silent revelation. This house didn't just live with little water, she lived under the discipline of scarcity. The entire family was trained by her, trained to depend on what had been saved, trained to honor little, trained to understand firsthand that life can get fragile very quickly. And when even water needs to be rationed like this, you begin to understand why the bread on this table was never just food. And then the bread appears, not as a symbol, not as a metaphor, not as a pretty image of a full table. It appears as survival. In the center of the patio on a simple surface, you see the dough being worked with repeated, firm movements without waste. Barley flour, measured water, a little salt. Nothing here is excessive. Nothing is decorative. Archaeological and historical evidence suggests that in first century Galilee, bread was the absolute basis of the daily diet, and that barley, coarser, darker, cheaper, was the most common grain among poor families. And this immediately changes the image that many people carry in their heads. Because we are not looking at very generous, colorful meals. We are looking at an eating routine built around necessities. Bread does not accompany the meal. Bread is the meal. It comes out of the clay oven with a strong smell, toasted on the outside, dense on the inside, and you soon realize that its texture is anything but light. There is no refined softness. There is no abundance of sifted wheat. There is weight. There is rusticity. There is slow chewing. Scholars estimate that between 50% and 70% of the average person's calories came from bread, which explains why eating bread could simply mean eating a meal. But that's not all. Look at what's around him. Maybe a lentil stew, maybe chickpeas, some olives, dried figs stored to last, a little olive oil, maybe wine diluted with water. And that, on many days, would be enough to call it a meal. Evidence suggests that the common diet in Nazareth was based heavily on grains, legumes, olive oil, and dried fruit, with meat appearing rarely, almost always, linked to festivities and special occasions. Now feel the impact of this on your body. You don't eat for variety. You eat for sustenance. You don't ask what you want. You eat what is there. And there is something deeply human about this, because scarcity doesn't just manifest itself on the plate. It enters the mind. It limits expectations. She teaches gratitude and frustration at the same time. You learn to be happy with little, because little is what sustains the house. And here comes the break in expectations. The simplicity of this table does not mean carelessness. It means discipline. Before eating, the family thanks you. Food is not treated as something automatic. He is received. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. Words like that didn't sound poetic in an environment like this. They sounded literal, because when bread sustains life, being grateful for it stops being a formality and becomes a daily awareness. And this raises a question that spans centuries. What happens to a family that lives like this every day? When food is simple, space is tight, and water is limited. What about rest, sleep, the body, intimacy, the very feeling of living? Because scarcity didn't stop at the table. She continued into the night, and inside that house, even sleeping required adaptation. When night falls, the house is no longer empty. It gets tighter. The courtyard slows down. The oven loses heat. The last animal sounds fade away. The neighbors' voices become more distant. But inside the house, nothing transforms into that comfortable silence that we associate with rest. Because resting here doesn't mean having space. It just means stopping work for a few hours. You return to the stone-hewn interior, and now he looks even smaller. During the day, the body is distracted by tasks. At night, he feels everything. The proximity of the walls, the low ceiling, the accumulated smell of smoke, fabric, skin, oil, clay, the temperature that drops quickly over the limestone. Evidence suggests that these indoor environments were mainly used for sleeping and storing essential items, while most active life took place in the courtyard precisely because closed rooms were limited, dark, and poorly ventilated. Now, imagine an entire family returning here. Not an individual, not just a couple, a family. Each mat rolled out on the floor occupies a precious piece of the environment. Each body lying down further reduces circulation. There is no concept of my corner as we understand it today. Space is shared to the limit. Sleeping side by side is not a planned gesture of affection. It's the inevitable consequence of living with few meters and many roles going on at the same time. And this begins to reveal something profound. Scarcity didn't just affect what was owned. It shaped the experience of the body itself. His body was never completely alone, never completely free, never completely turned off. During the day, he served his job. At night, he retired without really escaping his surroundings. Scholars point out that in small homes in the Galilean context, the boundaries between sleep, storage, domestic care, and preparation for the next day were extremely fluid. In other words, the house had no sectors. Layers of use. The same ground that supported footsteps during the day received tired bodies at night. The same environment that held jars, cloaks, and utensils also held vulnerability. A child could wake up in the middle of the night. An animal could be heard outside. The cold could force someone to adjust their cloak. The impregnated smoke could still slightly sting the eyes. But there's something most people don't realize. Living like this also required a constant form of self-control. You needed to restrain your movements, contain your voice, contain your consumption, restraining even his desire for comfort, because the environment simply couldn't offer much more than that. Discipline was not taught in words alone. It was imposed by the house itself. And yet, life went on before dawn. This is the detail that matters. Rest existed, but it was short. The body lay down, knowing that it would soon return to the patio, to the oven, to the measured water, to the ground grain, to manual work. There was no clear separation between time to live and time to produce. In Nazarene, the two mingled all the time. Evidence suggests that domestic routine in the first century was marked by repetitive and unavoidable daily work, especially in homes of modest means, where almost everything had to be prepared, repaired, or preserved by hand. And this is where the idealized image finally breaks down, because this house was not just poor in goods, she was demanding on the body, demanding on time, demanding with emotions, demanding about coexistence, and even so, it was not empty of meaning. In fact, this is exactly where the most unexpected revelation of all comes, because what appears to be just limitation from the outside hides something inside that much modern abundance has already lost. And this is where almost everyone goes wrong when imagining this house, because from the outside it just looks cramped, just poor, limited only. But look again. Material scarcity did not mean moral disorder. The lack of comfort did not mean the absence of dignity. In fact, evidence suggests that many Nazareth families organized their lives with a degree of discipline, purity, and intention that would surprise any modern eye. Archaeologists discovered limestone vessels used in everyday domestic life in the region, and this detail is greater than it seems. Unlike common pottery, limestone was associated with Jewish practices of ritual purity, because the stone had a special status within these laws. This means that even within simple houses with dirt floors, limited water, and limited food, there was a real concern about living in a holy way. Notice the contrast. Little space, but a lot of awareness. Little food, but gratitude. Little water, but be careful. Little comfort, but order. And this completely breaks the superficial image of poverty as synonymous with carelessness. No, this house was not a place abandoned to improvisation. It was a place trained by necessity and guided by conviction. And that changes everything, because suddenly you understand that the family wasn't just surviving in scarcity. She was forming character within her. Every jug in the right place, each portion measured, each cloak reused, each prayer repeated at dawn and at nightfall, each gesture taught something: self-control, reverence, limit, dependence. Scholars point out that the presence of these material elements linked to Jewish purity reveals that Nazareth was not just a poor village in Galilee, but a community seriously committed to its religious identity. But this raises an even stronger question. What happens when a child grows up in a house like that? When does she learn from an early age that almost nothing can be wasted? What water is not guaranteed? What bread is not banal? What work is not optional? That faith is not a weekend event, but an invisible structure sustaining the entire day. This is the point that most miss. The big revelation is not that Nazareth was simple. The simplicity of that house was demanding enough to form a soul. And perhaps that's exactly why this scenario matters so much. Because God did not choose an easy environment to enter the world. He chose an environment of discipline, a place where the body learned limits, where routine learned reverence, where little needed to be honored, where the invisible supported the visible. And here the story stops being just historical and starts to get personal, because we have been taught to associate God's presence with excess, comfort, expansion, visible abundance. But that house whispers otherwise. She says that the sacred also inhabits the tight. Also, visit the simple. It also settles where life seems too small to attract attention. And this is the turning point. What seemed like just a lack, maybe it was also preparation. What seemed like just a limitation, maybe it was also school. What seemed like just hardness, maybe it was mold from inside that house, something that the whole world could not yet see. And when you realize this, one last question begins to emerge with force. If the space was small, the food was little, and the water was measured, what kind of spiritual vision was formed within these walls? Because it was exactly there, in the most compressed ordinary of life, that the eternal began to take human form. And this is exactly where the story stops being just reconstruction and becomes confrontation. Because for a moment, you stop in the middle of this small courtyard between stone, smoke, flour, and measured water, and you realize something almost impossible to accept. This is where a mind was formed. It was here that a sensibility was shaped. It was here, within a routine so common that the world would never consider it important, that Jesus grew up, not in marble, not in comfort, not in abundance, but on repeat, in limit, in daily fidelity. Archaeologists discovered that the houses of Nazareth of the early Roman period were modest structures, often partially excavated in the rock, with few interior spaces and a functional central courtyard. This means that words, sounds, and gestures were repeated before the same eyes day after day. The sound of grain being ground, the smell of bread baking, the weight of the jug pulled from the cistern, oil lamp smoke rising slowly. The cloak used during the day serves as a cover at night. And that matters more than it seems, because no one goes through a childhood like that without being marked by it. When Jesus later talks about bread, light, thirst, a house built on rock, a lamp placed in the right place, he is not choosing random images to sound poetic. He is speaking from a lived world. Evidence suggests that the material elements present in Jesus' parables and teachings profoundly reflect domestic and working life in first-century Galilee. But look closer. It's not just a matter of scenery, it's a matter of inner formation. A house like this teaches that the essentials sustain life. It teaches that the invisible matters. It teaches that discipline is not oppression when it prevents waste. It teaches that gratitude is not born from abundance, but from awareness. It teaches that the ordinary is never really ordinary, when everyone's survival depends on it. And this is perhaps the most powerful part of all, because we have been trained to look for God in the extraordinary, in the temple, in the visible miracle, in dramatic interruption, the moment you break the routine. But Nazarene tells another story. Nazarene whispers that God also works in the rhythm of repetition, in silent work, in invisible care, In life, almost no one notices, and that raises a difficult question. How many times have you overlooked exactly the kind of place God chose to form the sun? How many times have you called small what heaven calls enough? How many times have you thought your routine had no spiritual value because it didn't seem great? Because it was in a house like this that you learned to wait. It was in a house like this that one learned to obey. It was in a house like this that we learn to honor the little without treating it as little. Scholars point out that the Jewish domestic routine in the first century was permeated by blessings, prayers, practices of purity, and constant memory of the covenant with God. So don't imagine this home just as a space of physical scarcity. Imagine it also as a space of continuous spiritual language, words of gratitude before the bread, words of faith at dawn, words of the Shema passing through the fall of night. The house might be small, but the spiritual world within it was not. And here, everything takes on an almost painful depth. The eternal God did not just visit human poverty, He consented to be formed within her. He consented to growing up hearing common sounds, in touching rough walls, in sleeping close to the floor, in knowing thirst before talking about living water, in knowing domestic darkness before saying it was the light of the world, in breaking common bread for years before declaring it to be the bread of life. But here's what changes everything. If He has sanctified this kind of life from within, then perhaps you are underestimating the sacred potential of your own routine. Maybe the days that feel small, repetitive, and cramped are not empty days. Maybe these are training days. Maybe God still likes to work where there is little audience, little space, and a lot of need for dependence. Because Nazareth was not just the place where Jesus lived. It was the place where everyday life became preparation. And when you finally understand this, you can no longer look at a simple house, a modest table, or an ordinary day in the same way. You begin to realize that the sacred doesn't always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it grows in silence, inside a stone house, while the world outside has no idea what is being prepared there. And now, after entering this house, feeling the cold weather, the smoke trapped in the air, the weight of the heavy water, and the hardness of a loaf of bread that was more of a necessity than a pleasure, the question is no longer how they lived. The question is, why does this affect you so much? Because deep down, what scares is not just the simplicity of that life. It is realizing that God did not avoid this simplicity. He entered her. He entered a tight space. He got into a repetitive routine. He entered a world where almost everything was limited. And yet, that place was not empty. It was full of presence. This is the point that transforms everything. We have been taught to look for meaning in what impresses, what grows, in what appears, in what seems big in everyone's eyes. But the house of Nazareth confronts this instinct. She shows that heaven can choose the little one without apologizing for it. Archaeological evidence shows that the houses of Nazareth were modest, partially excavated in the rock, organized around compact spaces, with cisterns, courtyards, and simple materials adapted to local scarcity. In other words, nothing there seemed extraordinary to anyone passing by outside, and perhaps that's exactly why this story hits us so deeply. Because many of our days feel that way too. Small ones, repetitive, tight, no shine, no audience, without anything that seems grand. But Nazareth whispers a truth that we almost forget. God does not despise the ordinary. He enters it, He works on it. He forms eternity within him, and it changes the way you look at your own life, your common table, your tiring routine, your silent work, your prayers that no one sees, the days that seem the same, the limitations you didn't choose. Maybe all this isn't just weight. Perhaps it is also a training ground. Perhaps some of the most sacred parts of your story are happening precisely in the environments that you call too simple. Scholars point out that first-century Jewish domestic life was permeated by manual labor, blessings, discipline of resources, and constant practices of faith, which transformed the routine into an ongoing space of spiritual formation. And here is the final twist. Jesus not only understands the pain of a difficult life, he understands the texture of it, understands the body's fatigue, understands the pressure of scarcity, understands the weight of repeating days, understands the value of a piece of bread, understands the relief of stored water, understands the silence of those who remain firm without being seen. Because before teaching crowds, he lived the ordinary. Before revealing glory, he inhabited limitation. Before talking about the kingdom, he grew up in a house where every resource mattered. So perhaps the most honest question is not what was inside a Nazarene home. Maybe the question is, what could God be forming inside your, while you think nothing important is happening? If this script made you see Jesus in a more human, closer, and deeper way like this video, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to remember that God also inhabits the simple places of life. And now, I want to hear from you. Which detail moved your heart more? The lack of space, the bread of survival, the limited water, or the idea that the Son of God chose to grow up in exactly such a place?